Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is Wednesday. It is April 26th. It's time for Business Analysis Live. I'm Susan Moore, Community Engagement Manager with IIBA.
And I'm Scott Bennett. I'm the manager of business analysis here at the International Institute of Business Analysis.
Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and also it's going to be my opportunity to geek out a little bit. We're going to talk about analysis for off-the-shelf products. I have spent the majority of my business analysis career doing either platform as a service kind of projects or just different vendor off-the-shelf product implementations over the years. And my observation is that while you still do business analysis, it's a little bit different. And so that's what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, so love to dig into this project. Years ago, this used to be called COTS, Commercial Off-the-Shelf Products. So Susan, why don't you just give us an overview for those who are not familiar with off-the-shelf products, what that actually means?
So, these days, these off-the-shelf products go by a number of different names. So COTS is one of them, commercial off-the-shelf products. But sometimes, especially if you're purchasing cloud versions, you might hear them called software as a service. You might hear them called platform as a service. Those might be a little bit bigger. Package as a service is another term that I've heard. Many times these off-the-shelf products, I mentioned that there are cloud versions, but there can also be what's called on-prem or on-premise versions. And those would be implementations where you're going to provide the infrastructure, servers, and all the other equipment to have that software installed locally. Sometimes you will also hear about COTS as coming out of a business's decision to build versus buy. Sometimes when they're assessing what's the better investment, they might talk about, should we build it? And they might do some business cases and ROI, return on investment kinds of projections, or they might want to think about buying it. And so when they're buying it, they're talking about going out and talking with different vendors about getting something that is already got a set of features, functionality that they can just bring in, and then, as I like to say, put their business in the box.
Yeah.
So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so let's start by going through maybe the life cycle of what you might go through. So you might purchase an off-the-shelf product, and then you would operationally run it over a period of years. Let's talk about the purchasing of it. I've seen some people go out on their own without the help of others and just look at what products are, and they get attracted to the bells and whistles. What's the danger of that?
The danger of that is another term that I'll give you today, which is shadow IT, meaning, and I've been around for some of this, where some well-meaning person on the business side, either they've talked to a vendor, they've talked to some salesperson, or they've done their own research and they have found this product which is going to solve all of their problems, and they'll plunk down the company credit card and they will bring that in. And the problem with those kinds of implementations is there's no oversight. So things that you might do to make sure that you've got proper disaster recovery, that you've got proper security around it, those can expose data. Let me tell you a quick story. I worked at a company where we discovered that our pharmacy division had a server underneath somebody's box where they had pharmacies sending pharmacy info. It was just a server. It didn't have any kind of security to it. We discovered it because someone had unplugged it, and the pharmacies were saying, hey, we can't send you this information. And then we thought, oh my gosh, we have exposed personally identifiable information potentially to bad actors. So yeah, it can be a problem if you don't go through a proper set of steps in order to bring in those off-the-shelf products.
Yeah, and these days with cybersecurity being more and more of a threat, it really is important that in all the projects we work on, that we have that as a consideration as we go through. So that's a really good point. Now, in terms of, so we're going to shop. Now, how does the business analysis professional help in that shopping experience?
Organizations that are deploying business analysis professionals, I think, have two opportunities to bring them in for these kinds of needs assessments or development of their business cases. One, when they are thinking about doing that build versus buy, because they can help to build the business case. They can also help with things like creating an RFP, a request for a proposal, or there's also an RFQ. There's a bunch of those RF words, but business analysts can help in the development of that. They can also help in the evaluation of the responses from the vendor. And I think, a great activity for the business analyst is to help put together whatever that chart is, where they're going to evaluate the responses against each other, because you do want this to be an equitable process. You're not just going for the lowest bid. You also want to make sure that you've got certain requirements of that vendor. You want to weight them. Second, is a little bit later on in the process when you start to put your business in the box, right? You want your business analysis professionals to work with the business in order to understand the processes, so that you're not just setting a bunch of configurations, but that you are doing it so that it supports the work that you do as an organization.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just focus in a little bit on what you said there on the weighting. In my experience, I've seen people that are looking for solutions might just make a list of, hey, here's the 15 or 20 things that I want, but they don't necessarily put the time and thought into providing weighting on the ones that are really important and the ones that are more nice to have. So putting a weighting would be maybe put a score against them that's, say, a 20 for the high ones and a 5 for the low ones, and then mathematically you can use that to score out the evaluation. So yeah, certainly in that upfront part, it's important to make sure that you're looking at the right things, you understand what the needs are, so when you're shopping, you know what you're getting. I just want to remind our viewers, we are live right now. We're taking your questions, so drop them in. Rosalind's working in the background. She's helping us with this podcast. So Rosalind will transfer those questions to us and we'll take them as we go here.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is helpful in that early stage needs assessment, business case development, is that business analysis professionals can also just be an objective third party in this. Sometimes we've got business folks who they've got relationships with vendors, or they feel particularly strongly about software one way or the other, because it might be adding some capability to their department, or it might be taking away. And so if you can have a business analysis professional who's just a disinterested third party, just getting the results back and putting them into a format where you can review those, I think it can help take a little bit of the emotion out of the purchase process.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about how to prep for making that decision. Let's say we've got the vendor aligned, we're ready to start doing the project. What's the business analysis work look like there?
I think the most critical activity at this point, and it's one that you and I have talked about on here, is business analysis planning. So I know companies think, I'm going to buy this tool, it does everything I need, we're just going to go start setting those configurations. But these can be expensive projects, especially if you don't know where you're going to go. And it can be expensive because many times you've got to use stakeholders and subject matter experts from within the business to help you with this activity. And you're taking them away from their day job. And so typically somebody is going to ask you, well, how much time are you going to need? What are you going to do, so that we can make sure that we're planning appropriately? And here's where business analysis planning can be your friend. One, you can start to put together your work breakdown structure, the activities that you need to do, with a dotted line to, these are the kinds of people I need, or the types of decision makers that are going to need to be involved in this. Two, it many times the software itself will dictate how you are going to get requirements. Meaning, if you're using something like an insurance system and I've got to put forms in it, I'm not going to go write a bunch of different specifications. If I take a peek in the back end of that system, The system may say, I need to know about 20 properties of that form in order to set it up. And so you don't need to write a document. Maybe what you need to do is develop some sort of a spreadsheet where you can start to identify all the properties of the forms. So you
Mm.
want to take the time to understand how to document requirements for the system so that you don't spin your wheels doing work that doesn't really make any difference. And then finally, in that business analysis planning, you want to package everything up. And you also, actually, there is a third thing. It will make a difference if you are going to use a vendor's systems implementer or a functional consultant, meaning you're going to bring in somebody who has done a bunch of these implementations, and you're going to be part of it. In most cases, those systems implementers will bring their own tools and templates. You don't have to build anything, but you will have to understand the activities that you need to do, and that may change your business analysis planning. So kind of focus on those three areas and then come out with a plan. That's going to be a little bit of a living plan, because as you do the first couple of configurations, you may learn and want to update that. But business analysis planning, you got to do it.
Okay. Now, as you were describing that, Susan, we've talked about project methodologies before. This sounds like we're doing a lot of planning up front. So it's a plan-driven type of initiative?
I think that it is. I know many times a lot of organizations will also use these COTS projects in order to do some sort of an agile transformation. So if they're not already working agilely, they might tack this on to this project, or they may decide that, yep, we've been doing agile in other parts of the organization. We're going to do it here. And listen, I've been at the front line of trying to talk IT leaders down because, they say, well, there's no planning in Agile. Why are we doing all of this planning? And because they can be expensive, you want to know where you need to go. And there's some nuances to this as well. So you didn't ask me specifically, how is it different for Agile? But I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a second. So when we talk about Agile, we are usually talking about development work, software development work. And it can be a great way to manage, setting those configurations, getting your testing done. But for this kind of work, you do want to spend a little bit of time in advance of those sprints, getting your plan, diving more deeply into the requirements. You might still do stories, but those stories will not be the requirements. The stories will be pointers to the requirements that you're going to implement.
Hmm.
So it is a little bit different. You do want to spend some time because ultimately you need to get to an endpoint, so that you can deliver what that tool is supposed to deliver for you.
Right. Yeah. So if we're sort of thinking about implementing this and we're getting close, one thing that I've noticed in my experience is testing. People hate
Mhm.
testing, and often I've relied on the subject matter experts to go into the system and say, okay, can what are the key functions you want to test out, and go through those. When you're talking about the planning of resources, I've seen a couple of failures where we didn't adequately plan out how much time we needed from someone or a group of people when they're in a peak of their business cycle.
Oh, that's,
Um,
yeah.
so that planning up front, yeah, I've seen bite us in the butt a few times in various projects I've worked on over my career. So yeah, it is important to get that right.
And that's a good point, because even though we're talking about business analysis planning, your cohorts in the other areas should be doing related planning to that work. Um, Traceability of all of this activity is going to be very important, because you are inevitably going to be asked one of three questions. Have we delivered what we said we would deliver yet? Have we finished our testing yet? And are we done yet? And so when you've done those planning activities up front and you've sequenced them together, when you get closer to the answers to those questions, you are better able to answer them directly instead of saying, well, I think maybe we need to go into the testing tool. I don't know. Again, there's a lot of upfront cost in these commercial off-the-shelf products. There's additional cost, and I won't even get into the conversation of what's capitalizable and what's not. But you know, there's a clock ticking on when you can start to make this a capitalizable project. So you
Right.
really want to get to that part as quickly as possible so that you can start to get that return on that investment, and your company will be happy.
So we have our first question here.
Excellent.
As most products offer extensive parameterization, do you have an approach to recommend for parameterization analysis?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Um, you know, I think some of this probably is upfront. So I'm not, parameterization is a little bit of an unusual word for me, but I will say this, you know, commercial off-the-shelf products are essentially, uh, you know, very easy to do a quick mock-up of something and show it back to your customer. And so I think parameterization analysis can look something like, okay, we've got this new form that we want to implement. Let me go into our test environment, set that up, and let's take a look live and get that subject matter experts or that stakeholder's opinion. Is this doing what you want it to do? If not, let's go back and understand the things that it's not doing, and then let's go back and take a look at if those are potential capabilities of the system, so that you can make parameterization analysis a live activity instead of waiting till the very end when it gets really expensive to, you know, figure this out.
Right. Right. Okay. So from starting the project to implementing this new solution, is there anything else that you would consider from a business analysis perspective?
So I mentioned requirements traceability. I think that that traceability is really important here, but let's take a step back, because I think having your requirements in a place where they can be traced is going to be very important. Um, you know, if you've got a systems implementer that you're working with, many times they're going to bring in, they might be Word templates, they might be Excel templates, they might be a tool. But what you want to figure out very quickly is, where are we going to track and manage and monitor all of these requirements in a place where I've got the ability to source control it, to version history it, if that's a thing, and to be able to connect it to other things. And that may or may not be something like a Word document or an Excel document. So you want to consider that. Um, the other thing that I think of is, where is the rest of your team? Are they locally with you where you could, you know, share things easily? Are they offshore? Are they distributed? How are people going to interact with these requirements? So you'll want to think about that as you're thinking about your requirement management plan as well. Um, let's see, requirement management is really important. Well, and you also have to think about downstream of requirement management, right? So you are building up this tool, and you know, when you do that, typically you're not going to rebuild this anytime in the near future. So you want an inventory of those requirements that you can update as needed as things change in your organization, that you can share with your support team when they need to know, what bug do I have to fix and where am I going to fix it, your training team. And plus, I always think it's nice when you can have your requirements in a place that the business folks that gave you those requirements can see them and interact with them. And I'll tell you another quick story. We used models for some of our rules that we had built into a system. And what we ended up doing is creating decision trees for each of those kinds of decisions that we had to do. And so we kept a library of those. And when one of our insurance team said, okay, we are changing the rules for the state of Connecticut, they could go in and they could look at our decision workflow, they could print it off, they could go in and scratch it up, and then they could hand us that piece of paper back and say, here are the places where we need for you to make those rule changes. And so then we would update that document, we would hand it off to our rules developer, And then we would make sure that it matched. And then we would hand them that piece of paper back and say, okay, here's what it says. You check it out for yourself and see if you're good. It became a great way and kind of a self-fulfilling requirement artifact that we could use it in all stages. So
Yeah.
um,
One other element is a little bit into planning, a little bit broader than business analysis that I've seen challenges before, is not thinking up front around the non-functional requirements of
mhm.
a RACI chart, or who's going to do what from an operational perspective. What role is the vendor going to play in that? What role is your operations team going to play in that? Do you have maybe a product owner that oversees all of this? You've got some work that you're going to have to do after implementation. We'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of getting to the goal of getting it in place and turned on, I think you need to consider how this is all going to work together once it goes live. Because if you're scrambling the last week or two before you go live, it's going to be difficult.
And I think we are taking a turn towards change management, and that's yeah, because having that business analyst professional that's part of that implementation, if they are involved in each of these areas, I think it sets you up for a better change management experience when things in that system have to change.
Right.
So yeah, I've seen things go sour at the transfer of that system to somebody else, and for any number of reasons, right? And so some of the things that I've told you today that I think are very important are because I probably have a story about how we didn't do that thing and it did not end well, or we had to do a lot of scrambling. The promise of an off-the-shelf product is that as we used to say, you put the CD in the deck and you press go and ta-da, you can just start using it. That's the promise of it.
Yeah.
But if you don't get those things right, then it is just, it can be very disappointing and really expensive in the
Right.
end.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question here for you, Susan. How do you analyze the risk of a vendor lock-in?
Okay, I'm not sure I know what a vendor lock-in is. What do you,
The way I interpret that lock-in is you're moving to a product with a vendor, and you're now so invested into that product, it's painful to potentially switch to a different one.
oh my
That's
gosh.
that's the way I'm interpreting it.
Yeah, I've been on that project, by the way. So I do think that you have to, I do think that you've got to be really transparent. Again, here is where those artifacts like the request for proposal, the waiting sheet that you did, how they answered their questions, knowing what your business case are, having those artifacts there can help you to set some boundaries very early on. Actually, there's one more statement of work. Um, the contractual piece of this as well. So the combination of those things, I think, can help you to navigate, if things are going well and everyone is delivering and you're moving, and if you are not, what it is that you need to do, when you need to draw the line and potentially, move on, kill the project, as they say, and move on. Those can be really difficult, because I think many organizations really try every possible thing to turn those projects around. And you want that. You don't want to cut the project too early, but make it as objective and non-emotional as possible, right? Because then I think you'll make better decisions.
Okay.
Hopefully
There was
that was
a
a good.
question from the last live session we had. It's lengthy, but let me just
Mhm.
summarize where I think it's going. Basically, you could be working with a good brand or a well-known brand, but even their architecture might be subpar. And how do you evaluate that as you're going through looking at these products? So rather than just go with a brand name that, hey, I know them, let's go with that. How do you evaluate them against the other players?
What I've seen, and I'm thinking about one of these that I've done a couple of years ago, where we did have, the big guy in the room, and then we had some smaller players. Here's where that weighting can make a difference on those answers. Um, And I think you can hopefully offset some of that by having those folks come in to your organization and do some demos. And don't bring the sales guys. Like bring somebody that has experience configuring that tool, who's worked in the consulting world, to help customers to create what they want, and then learn from them, see how they operate, but don't just see how they configure the system. What kind of a culture when they come in? Do they come in like they own the room? Do they come in like they're really here for you as the customer? What's their overall sense? I mean, you really want to ask a lot of questions about them, their culture, their customer service. You also want to call references. That's another one, because, right, don't just take it from the vendor. You also want to talk to customers, and and if a vendor is not willing to let you talk to their customers, that's a red flag. If you know some folks who have worked with them, reach out. Be transparent with your vendor about that, by the way, because they're also kind of looking at you, wanting to know if you're a good customer to work with. So it does go
Yeah.
both ways.
Yeah, I have worked for some large financial institutions, and I've had the luxury of working with sourcing professionals. And some of the things that they look into that I would have never thought about are the financial stability of the organization. The leadership, certainly the referrals, references, making sure that they're valid. But it's interesting when you talk to a sourcing professional, what they look at from a vendor is very different than what a business analysis professional would look at. And I've also had experience too of cybersecurity professionals working with me to say, you know what, we need this form filled out, we need this, to state that, the data will be protected because it's no longer within your domain, and how they deal with intrusions. So these other stakeholders that you might not initially think about can really help contribute to making a good decision.
That is a great point. On that project that I worked on, we had a sourcing professional services organization that we worked with initially. They were able to help us, bring those vendors to the table, having done some initial legwork for us. They were the ones who also had worked with references. If you're going to make a big investment, and so one of the last projects I did, it was a platform as a service. It was a tens of millions of dollars investment. That can be a very good service to include in your overall business case, is that sourcing professional, because they can do things and ask questions that you might not. If you're making a smaller investment in something, consider if it's a good investment. But I think that's a great point about sourcing professionals.
So Susan, we're live, and I'm going to put you on the spot because I can do this because we're live.
Yay!
I want to ask the audience if there was one template that Susan could provide with all of her years of experience to help you in your off-the-shelf product, what would that be? So please put that in the comments. We'll take a look at that, and maybe I can convince Susan to do a little work on that front.
And go dive deep into the vault to see what I might have. That is a great question. We had, I haven't really touched on low code or no code, but solutions, but essentially those are off the shelf products to a degree. And I had a friend of mine come who does those implementations every day. So in our archive, there is analysis for low code products, and he also gave a great framework for how you should get ready for these. It actually, so if you're a member, it's in our webinar archive, and who knows, maybe I'll have him come back if there's a lot of interest in this topic, because a lot of companies, a long time ago, I can remember when I worked in IT, and I remember our CTO saying, I will never have a cloud product in this organization. And his concern was cybersecurity at the time.
Right.
Now I think there's maybe not as much. I think it is more common to have cloud products, but it is it's a little bit of a different kind of a framework for analysis. And we don't talk about that a lot across business analysis professionals. We kind of approach everything with the same set of steps. This really is a little bit different. So that's why I'm passionate about it. We have more questions. Let's see. Is there a tool or method to measure or evaluate a commercial off-the-shelf SLA towards deciding if you should continue with the service provider or not. Um, Again, I think some of those artifacts that I mentioned, the responses to the request for proposal, your weighting of those, definitely your statement of work or whatever contract you signed. I think those are really important. Usually, whenever we did any so I was on both sides of that commercial off the shelf thing, by the way. I sometimes was the vendor and I sometimes was the part of the business organization. Many times we had an early project management kind of conversation where we would start to put together service levels specific to that project. And we created dashboards and things so that we could monitor that. So if those conversations don't happen, and look, they don't have to be big. If you're doing something small, if you're doing a smaller implementation of something, have the conversation so that you can set expectations up front. But that's what, and they SLAs will be different depending on what the system is, who the vendor is, what your needs are.
Right. So Susan, I want to shift gears here from getting that product up and running to how do you run this thing on an ongoing basis and the considerations for that and where business analysis professionals play. But before I do that, just a short commercial break. We do have a LinkedIn Live happening every 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now, we've got tips for new business analysis professionals. So I'll ask Rosalind to drop a link in there. You can follow that link, you can register, and it'll set up a reminder for you. So with that out of the way, so we've now got a system live and it's running. We've talked about this is sort of a planned approach, not an agile approach. You got to get it all planned out. But once you've got it live, what are those considerations that you might not think about until you're in there about keeping this product updated and people have enhancements and the approach to that type of thing?
One of the other topics that I geek out about a little bit is demand management. So making sure that you've got a solid way of taking in requests for this product that can be evaluated, that can be, estimated or whatever needs to happen there, so that as those changes are coming in, that they are not completely out of left field. Many times what I find is that you'll get the product in and live, and then what seems like they are change requests are in fact business processes that may not have effectively changed. And so sometimes as those come in, you realize, uh-oh, I think we've actually got some business process work. We might need to dial this back. So making sure that you've got a way that your business folks that are using that new tool know where to go to request enhancements, I think is important. And then having somebody on the receiving end that can help to sort them out, to make sure that not everything just goes right into the development bucket, but that you use a little bit more time to understand what the real need is so you can do it well. We've talked about requirement management and how critical that becomes after it's implemented. You've spent all this money, and this is one of the few times where you can put an actual dollar amount to what it cost you to build requirements. So that knowledge asset that you are left with is priceless, as they say. And so here's where you have the ability to go back into those and make sure as you change them that you are change the features of the system, that you are changing those requirements, so that you can make sure on the back end that people who need to train or communicate out changes to the business users have that information. What's been your experience here? I mean, those are kind of my thoughts, but how about you on any sort
In
of?
terms of maintaining a project, the one pain point I've seen, especially with large systems, is when there's a system update. It
Mm,
it's not just you're putting in patches for there's a lot of testing involved, and that almost in itself turns into a mini project of, okay, you've got these stakeholders across your organization, depending on the system, you now have to pull them together. Hey, we need to do testing in this particular area. Here are the scenarios we're going to go through and test. I need your feedback, and it can become challenging. So it's thinking about that operational model, I think, is important. And
yeah.
if you think about that in advance and get the leadership buy-in, it becomes easier to have the conversation of, hey, it's time for testing.
That's right.
If you've never had that up front and you're 6 to 12 months down the road and you encounter this, you could get a lot of resistance to people saying, well, you told us that this would operate on its own. Why do we need to test now? So it's that in itself I've seen as sometimes of a challenge. The other thing I've noticed too, if a project doesn't go through strong requirements before implementation, when you go live, you're going to be really, really busy because of all
Yeah,
these, oh, I need this, oh, I need this. But
that's right.
if you go through that really well in a well-structured manner and you got the right stakeholders, identify the right things, test the right things out, configure them, that going live experience will be much lighter. So there can be a dramatic difference there. If you try and take some shortcuts, you're going to pay for it. If you invest the time up front, you should be getting a crisper implementation.
Um, we didn't even talk about upgrades, but obviously, if you are buying any vendor product, whether it's in the cloud or it's on-prem, you are going to be doing upgrades to that. And many times you have to take them. I mean, it would almost in some instances it potentially could be irresponsible to not take them.
Yeah.
And those changes cannot just change the system, but they could do unintended things to configurations that you have in there. I mean, I've done SharePoint work over the years, and you would take upgrades and patches and everything would be fine, and then you would get a big upgrade, and then, oh my gosh, now my workflows don't work. So there is additional analysis that you have to do. It's like its own backlog of work that you are not fully in control of. You're going to have the vendors submitting things to you, and you will need to do analysis on that. Look, you could just like upgrade it and see what happens, but if this is a mission critical system, you will not want to do that. You will want to put that patch into a safe environment and then test things out along the way. So it does increase your testing, both when you get those patches or upgrades and then when you do the business testing with them. But you also remind me that the danger in just thinking of commercial off-the-shelf tools as I'll just have some developers just put some stuff in there is that our developers are really well-meaning, but they don't always understand the big picture of the business. And so they will, if you hand them a specification, many times they'll just code that. If they don't understand that full business picture, you can end up with a system that really doesn't do the things that you need. So having that business analyst there to understand and ask those good questions up front about how does this thing, how is it working in your process? What do you need what's the intended outcome of this, so that, you're really getting a system that does what you need for it to do. Not,
Right.
yeah. So let's see. We do have one more question. Maybe this is our last question. Can you share more details on project requirement, the requirement traceability matrix? For example, how to handle multiple change controls and how to avoid that. You and I have had some conversations about traceability matrix. Hey, we did a whole business analysis live on
We did.
traceability matrix. I will first say this. You can't necessarily avoid multiple change controls. In fact, that could be okay. Just depending on where you are and how many people come in, and but I don't know. I'm going to let you start this first.
Sure. Multiple change controls. I agree with your statement. You can't necessarily change that. Part of what will minimize it is doing analysis well, but you can't control the culture in an organization. So sometimes these things happen. Sometimes there's organizational changes. Sometimes there are people in leadership positions that change their mind. It's the nature of working in business. The key is to make sure you capture the change, assess the impact of the change. How much is this going to impact the budget? How much is it going to impact the timeline? And then bring that back to stakeholders to say, here's what you've asked for. These are the impacts. Do you agree? That is a really important communication part. Once you've got that agreement, then it's a matter of making sure you update everything from there downstream. So your requirements document, your testing scenarios that you might have created already, and making sure it's updated. When I do that, I have a practice of every single document that I work on, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, I've got a version number in the document and on the file title. And every time there's a version change, I put a summary as to what's changed and highlight the changes in a different color. That way, the people that use these downstream, they say, okay, this is version 5. I can see, Scott's highlighted these 3 yellow things that have changed. Everything else is the same. So I need to adjust these things. It's really important not just to capture what the need is, but to clearly communicate it so that everyone downstream is receiving it and actioning it. If they don't receive it, don't action it, you're going to end up with surprises.
Yeah, there will be no change, or the change will not be correct. The other thing I'll add to this is that having a strong change control committee, whomever that is, when you are thinking about work intake, it should not be like a sieve, meaning, somebody puts in a change and then miraculously it just happens. You really want to have a strong set of filter steps in between there to understand what is the need. And I think business analysis professionals are well positioned to go get a little more information. And then having that committee, whether it's 3 people, whether it's a broader committee, depending on the users of the platform, to assess those changes. And I know, I get it. People will say, why do we have to involve all these people? But because you need different perspectives, and business organizations that invest in these kinds of systems, if you can get them to get this part right, meaning the change management piece, they will have a system that will, decrease, loss or risk. It'll increase profits, and they will be doing the right things. And those people that are sitting on that committee assessing the change will understand enough about the business to know if some of those changes coming in are things that need to be done or not, because each of those changes has a dollar amount attached to it. They're not free, even though it may be done internally by teams. So you want a strong committee that is willing to assess everything and give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So,
right. Okay, well, Susan, I'm going to be looking at the chat after this to figure out, if we were to get Susan to make a template, what template would that be?
What would it be? Yeah, I am happy to share that. We'll have to figure out where we'll share it. Also, I would be interested from the folks out there. Do you want somebody to come back and talk about analysis for low code systems? Are you doing a lot of SharePoint, QuickBase, Salesforce, any of those kinds of things? Because I think it's a hot topic, but I'd be curious if others are interested in hearing a speaker on that. Goodness, this has been a good one today. So I'm excited that we talked about it, and I'm looking forward to 2 weeks when we talk about, we're going to have to think back to our days as a new business analyst and pull those tips for new BAs. But I hope you guys will join us. So thanks, Scott.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and we'll leave another one right here for you to help you in your business analysis career. If you haven't subscribed to the IIBA YouTube channel yet, you can click over here and click on the bell icon to get notified every time we publish a brand new video.